Let's play a little game of good news, bad news. Good news, Via Rail trains mostly leave the station on time. The bad news, they very often don't arrive on time. They're chronically delayed, they break down.
When they're late, you never get any notice.
We are expected to be delayed another hour or so.
According to Via Rail's own annual report, they've almost never been less reliable in getting you from point A to point B when they say they will. And I've gone back through 20 plus years of annual reports. 59% on-time performance is very nearly the worst it's been.
The service has really declined and the quality of customer care is terrible. That's what passenger rail experts are telling us.
9 hours, no AC, no washrooms.
You come all the way down here waiting to get on a train and then, cancel.
But let's try this again. Good news, Via Rail has never pulled in more revenue than it does now. Bad news, it's also almost never lost so much money. Via Rail was in the hole nearly $400 million last year. So what's going on? Why are Via Rail trains so late and such a financial liability? And what do those two things have to do with each other? One of the most important things to understand about Via Rail is that while they own the trains, the tracks are a different story. And I'll show you what I mean. Via Rail's routes span just about the entire country, from Vancouver to Halifax. More than 100 stations, serving more than 400 communities. But for all the thousands of kilometers of railroad track it runs on, do you know how much Via Rail actually owns and controls? 3%. Slightly less than 3%, actually. And this is a problem.
To me, rail track, rail ownership, and rail control is really the key driver of performance that Via Rail has to address.
In a few words, it's about who has the right of way. You see, most of Canada's rail network is single track, but different trains still need to go in different directions. So to allow trains to pass each other, they build what are called passing sidings, which are essentially just different tracks that allow trains to leave the main track so that the other train can go through. So if two trains are humming along but heading in opposite directions, dispatch will tell one train, hey, you've got to get off the main track and let the other train through. That means slowing down and waiting for the other train. And if it's a choice between a passenger train and a CN freight train hauling, $50 million worth of cars, and time is money, the choice is pretty clear. You remember how I said Via Rail's ownership share of its routes, like the literal track its trains ride on, is just under 3%? Well, the majority owner, Canada-wide, on all Via Rail routes is actually CN Rail, with 83% of the pie.
Via owns the trains, it's Via staff that run the trains, but essentially they're operating on somebody else's track.
And while CN is contractually obligated to share its rails with Via, when the two companies' trains come face to face, the pecking order is pretty clear.
Via is a tenant, you could say. They're the second place.
It's operating with one hand tied behind its back.
According to a statement sent to us by Via Rail, in the Quebec City-Windsor corridor, our busiest route, 73% of Via Rail delays are caused by issues related to the host railway. But why have Via Rail's trains gotten later and later over time? Like their on-time performance has gotten worse. Well, traffic has gotten worse.
The dominant railways are also increasing their activity and their service offerings.
Here's how many carloads of freight CN has shipped every year over the last quarter century. You can see that's a clear trend line up.
Freight's doing well. They're doing gangbusters.
And when CN gets bigger, Via gets squeezed. Freight, not passengers, is the #1 priority, and sometimes freight breaks down.
If a problem happens on a CN train or a CP train that breaks down on the tracks, then Via can't get the trains to go through. They have to wait till CP or CN solves their problems, then they can go and send their trains.
And here's one more thing to consider. If we go back to this map showing Via Rail's routes across the country, and we think about that 3% of track they do own, a big chunk of that is along the Ottawa-Montreal route. You know what Via Rail's on-time performance is on that stretch of track? About 95%. about Via Rail's situation is that their problem is an expensive one to solve.
People might say, well, why don't you just, build your own track? And you can appreciate that what it takes to assemble a corridor of land to have a dedicated track for a train operation is enormously expensive.
Underscore enormously. We're talking more than $10 million per kilometer? That was the recent estimate for a proposed project between Toronto and Quebec City, up to $12 billion for 1,000 kilometers of new service. And track building is complex.
Just imagine the political and legal conversations that have to take place if you're trying to stitch together a route across provinces, counties, cities. That's what the real significant hurdle is.
It's a massive undertaking. Obviously, central Canada and where Via Rail travels, a lot of it is heavily urbanized. There isn't a lot of space between these tracks to add more trackage.
And let's set aside the track for a moment so we can talk about the trains themselves. The industry norm, according to Via Rail, is for trains to be replaced every 30 to 40 years. But many of their trains, especially on longer and more rural journeys, are 65 years old or older. Some of these trains date back to the 1950s, and old trains break down. Simply put, says Via Rail CEO, our existing trains need to be replaced as they are past their prime and will be forced into retirement in the coming years. This creates a huge financial pressure on Via Rail. Its trains are chronically late. They're getting old. They're operating on borrowed infrastructure. It would take a massive investment to turn the company around, and in the meantime, every trip a passenger takes actually costs Via Rail money.
We're seeing with Via Rail that the more passengers you have, the more money you lose.
Delays can be expensive. Via Rail already doesn't have full control over its schedules because those schedules have to be designed with freight traffic in mind. Throw in an unplanned delay, and that can have a knock-on effect on other routes. Then think about keeping staff on board a stuck train. Labor is already the single biggest line item in Via Rail's operating expenses, accounting for nearly half of the money it spent last year. And ultimately, if Via Rail develops a reputation for being unreliable, which arguably it already has,
you can count on Via Rail for the same low-speed train service that we had when we incorporated in 1977. Across the ocean, they have bullet trains.
People are routinely delayed for hours on end. I mean, we're talking about 4 in 10 trains not arriving on time. So there's a good chance if you get on a Via Rail train, you're going to be late.
That absolutely has an impact on the company's bottom line.
If you have delays on your system, people are not going to ride your system.
Via Rail's ridership has yet to fully recover from its pre-pandemic high of about 5 million riders a year. Last year, it fell 20% short of that, with around 4 million riders. And the revenue it brings in from those riders simply isn't enough to cover the cost of running the system.
By Via Rail's own calculation, for every mile any individual passenger travels on its routes, it doesn't actually make money. It loses 42 cents. And you multiply that out by around 910 million passenger miles, and what you end up with is last year's operating shortfall of just over $380 million.
Now, maybe after all that, you're thinking, surely this is a crown corporation in crisis. But every expert we spoke to said that's probably the wrong way to look at it.
Public transit in general is not a money-making system. It's an essential service that we have to provide for everybody in the region.
Profitability just isn't a core part of Via Rail's mandate. This is what a Via Rail spokesperson told us. It's important to recognize that passenger rail is considered a public service around the world and is subsidized to fulfill its role as a vital link for communities, including remote and Indigenous communities where train travel may be the only available mode of transportation. And Canada is an awfully large country, with Via Rail trying to do the work of connecting urban to rural and back again.
In some areas, you're linking some small towns that, along the way to get to Montreal. So here you need to keep these trains running. It's essential to have the network for the economy and for the economical health of the country.
Look one more time at this Via Rail map. Whether you look at its corridor routes between Quebec and Ontario, through big towns or small towns, long trips, short trips, busy routes, sleepy routes, not a single one operates at a profit. Not one. They all lose money. And the more popular it is, the more money it loses. But that's how public services work, right?
We are paying a subsidy to Via Rail, but then again, the roads are highly subsidized. We never talk about that. We also are heavily subsidizing public transit, whether it be the subway or LRT lines or even just the buses. We never talk about that as being a problem. So why is Via Rail so different?
The good news, though, for Via Rail is that I haven't seen any indication the government is looking to cut. It's actually invested in new trains. The question is, what will it take for Canadians to want to ride them?
How many generations of Canadians have grown up with, Via not being sort of a priority option for travel?
Via Rail trains operate on average at around 60% capacity. Some years even lower than that. And their chief competition, when you think about it, isn't really freight. It's cars, it's planes, it's every reason you, statistically, probably haven't taken the train in a long time. That is the issue Via grapples with each and every day, whether its trains are late or on time.